When their only daughter stole everything and vanished into the Arizona sunset, two elderly souls stood shivering in a Minnesota snowstorm with nothing but a suitcase, a cast-iron pan, and a cat who hated everyone until they found salvation rusting in a frozen field, a bullet-riddled World War II plane that became the strangest home love ever built. But just when they thought they'd survived it all, black SUVs rolled up with news that would change everything. Before we continue this wonderful story, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, the Caribbean, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now let's get to where the story began. The wind that December afternoon didn't just blow, it accused. It howled through the skeletal branches of naked oaks and slapped against Evelyn Parker's weathered brown cheeks like a vindictive ex-lover who'd finally tracked her down. She pulled her threadbare wool coat tighter, the one she'd owned since 1987, the one that used to smell like cinnamon and hardware store sawdust, but now just smelled like defeat and someone else's donated charity. "Keep moving, Evie," George rumbled beside her, his voice a gravelly comfort, wrapped in exhaustion. His beard, once neatly trimmed for Sunday services and Chamber of Commerce meetings, now sprawled across his face like wild cotton, frosted with ice and dignity, lost somewhere between their third eviction notice and the moment their daughter's phone number turned into 3 automated beeps and a dial tone. Evelyn didn't answer. She was too busy calculating the mathematics of survival, the kind of arithmetic they don't teach you in school. 2 seniors, 74 and 76 respectively. 1 cat carrier containing Whiskers, their orange tabby, with the temperament of a prison warden and the loyalty of a ride-or-die accomplice. $347 in crumpled bills hidden in George's left boot. No home, no family. And a Minnesota winter that was just getting started, flexing its muscles like a bully who'd finally cornered his victim in an alley. Behind them, the village of Millbrook Creek disappeared into the white haze, all 732 souls tucked safely into their heated homes, probably sitting down to pot roast and cable television, blissfully unaware that 2 of their longest-standing residents were now officially homeless. Or maybe they knew, maybe they just didn't care. That's the thing about small-town Minnesota. Nice, it had an expiration date, and apparently the Parkers had reached theirs. That passed her. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice sharp enough to cut through the wind. Had the audacity to call the sheriff. Over a cat scratch, a tiny scratch. I've seen worse damage from a rose bush. George chuckled despite everything, the sound rattling in his chest like loose change in a tin can. To be fair, Whiskers did draw blood, and it was during the Lord's Prayer. The man was trying to grab him. What did he expect? Whiskers don't play about his personal space. Never has, never will. They trudged forward, boots crunching through snow that had already buried the remnants of last week's snowfall. The field they were crossing belonged to old man Patterson, or used to, before he died, and his kids sold it to some development company that promised luxury rural living and delivered nothing but survey stakes and broken promises. The land stretched endlessly before them, white and indifferent, punctuated only by the occasional fence post leaning at drunken angles. Evelyn's mind wandered, as it often did these days, back to when wandering meant something different. Back to when it meant Sunday drives in their 72 Buick, George's hand on her knee, Melissa in the back seat, singing off-key to the radio. Back to when Parker's fix-it-all hardware was the heart of their world, every nail sorted, every paintbrush accounted for, every customer greeted by name. She'd been the queen of that little kingdom, could tell you the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead from across the room. Could recommend the perfect sealant for any leak, the right sandpaper for any surface. "I can't believe she just left us," Evelyn said suddenly, surprised by her own voice. They'd maintained a careful silence about Melissa for 3 weeks now, as if not speaking her name might somehow undo the abandonment. George's jaw tightened beneath his frozen beard. "Don't. Don't what? Don't acknowledge that our daughter liquidated our entire life savings. Don't mention that she sold our house, the house your father built with his own hands, to pay off her boyfriend's cryptocurrency debts. Don't. Evie. His voice cracked, and that shut her up faster than any argument could. George didn't crack. George was granite, was foundation, was the man who once carried her across a flooded street during the '03 storm and never mentioned it again, because that's just what you did. Hearing that fracture in his voice felt like watching load-bearing walls crumble. They walked in silence after that, the only sound their labored breathing and Whiskers' occasional indignant yowl from his carrier. The cat, at least, still had some fight left in him. Evelyn envied that. Her own fight had been slowly draining since the embezzlement, since Gerald Morrison, trusted friend, business partner, and apparently world-class sociopath, had methodically stolen $73,000 from their accounts while helping himself to their inventory. Since the arthritis in her hands turned every morning into a negotiation with pain, since George's heart started beating to its own experimental jazz rhythm that terrified her more than she'd ever admit. The doctor's bills alone could have funded a small nation. "George," she said after a while, her voice softer now, "where are we even going?" He didn't answer immediately, just kept walking, each step deliberate, as if he knew something she didn't. And then she saw him stop, his head tilting slightly to the right, that look crossing his face, the same look he got when he spotted a salvageable lawnmower at the dump or figured out how to fix a unfixable furnace. "George, do you see that?" Evelyn followed his gaze across the white expanse. At first, she saw nothing but snow and the grey smudge of sky pressing down like a low ceiling. But then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A shape, hulking and impossible, half buried in a natural depression in the land. Metal, riveted panels, a tail fin jutting up at an angle like a shark's fin frozen mid-breach. "Is that a plane?" George breathed, and something in his voice changed. Hope, maybe, or madness. At this point, Evelyn wasn't sure there was much difference. They approached it like archaeologists discovering a tomb, each step revealing more of its impossible presence. It was massive, far larger than it had appeared from a distance. A transport plane, military by the looks of it, World War II era, if Evelyn's memory of George's endless History Channel binges served her correctly. The fuselage was pockmarked with what looked like bullet holes, the aluminum skin weathered to a dull grey-green patina. Snow had drifted against one side, nearly burying the landing gear, what was left of it, anyway. The windows were either missing or so filthy they might as well be. "It's been here for years," George murmured, walking around it with the reverence of a man in a cathedral. "How did we never know about this?" "Because we've been too busy running a business and living our lives to traipse around abandoned fields looking for war junk," Evelyn replied. But even she couldn't inject much venom into it. There was something about the plane, something stubborn in how it refused to fully surrender to the elements, that spoke to her. George found an opening, a cargo door hanging half off its hinges, and peered inside. Evelyn watched his broad shoulders block the entrance, watched him go still in that way he did when his mind was working overtime, calculating angles and possibilities. "Evie, come look at this." She didn't want to. She wanted to keep walking, to find some shelter that didn't involve tetanus risks and structural instability. But her feet moved anyway, carrying her to the opening where George stood. The interior was darker than the outside, lit only by weak winter light filtering through cracks and bullet holes. But it was dry. The floor, though dusty and littered with debris, was intact. The ribbed structure of the fuselage arched overhead like the skeleton of some great beast, surprisingly solid. It smelled of rust and old oil and decades of abandonment, but underneath that was something else. Potential. "You're thinking what I think you're thinking," Evelyn said, not a question. "It's got bones," George replied, running his hand along one of the internal support beams. "Good bones. Structures still sound. And look," he pointed to the rear of the plane, where what appeared to be part of the crew quarters remained relatively intact. There's actual walls back there. Insulation even. Ancient. But it's there. George, this is insane. More insane than freezing to death? More insane than begging for shelter in a town that's made it clear we've overstayed our welcome? He turned to face her, his blue eyes intense beneath frost-crusted eyebrows. Evie, I've got $300, a bad heart, and too much pride to die in a homeless shelter. This plane, it's shelter. It's dry, and it's not kicking us out for having a cat. Evelyn looked at Whiskers, who had managed to poke his orange face against the mesh of the carrier, his yellow eyes surveying their potential new kingdom with the discernment of a furry real estate agent. The cat, sensing her gaze, meowed not his usual indignant yowl, but something softer, almost approving. "We don't even know if it's structurally safe," she argued, but she was already setting down her suitcase, already calculating what they'd need. Old habits died hard, and she'd spent 50 years solving problems with hardware and determination. "I'll check it out properly, test the floor, check for major damage. But Evie," he reached for her hand, his fingers rough and familiar. "I think we just found our home." She wanted to laugh, she wanted to cry. She wanted to call someone, anyone, and tell them that her life had become so absurdly desperate that a crashed warplane in a frozen field was now looking like prime real estate. But there was no one to call. Melissa had made sure of that, and their friends, the ones who hadn't already shuffled away from their misfortune like it was contagious, were all back in town, warm and comfortable and completely unaware. So instead, Evelyn Parker, 74 years old, veteran of 5 decades in retail hardware, survivor of betrayal and bankruptcy and abandonment, squeezed her husband's hand and said, "Check the floor first. I'm not dying because you fell through some rotten panel. And George, if we're doing this, we're doing it right. This isn't just shelter, this is home. You understand me? We're making this a home." George's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen in weeks. "Yes, ma'am." As the winter wind howled outside and the light began to fade, George Parker stepped fully into the broken belly of that ancient plane, testing each section of floor with methodical care. Evelyn released Whiskers from his carrier, watching as the cat immediately began exploring, tail high, claiming territory with the confidence of a conqueror. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the layers of hurt and anger and exhaustion, something small and stubborn flickered to life. It wasn't hope, not yet. Hope was too expensive, too risky. But it was something. A refusal to quit. A middle finger to the universe. A spark in the dark that whispered, "We're still here. We're not done. And if the world thinks it can break us, it's got another thing coming." Outside, snow continued to fall, indifferent and eternal. But inside that broken plane, 2 people and 1 judgmental cat began to imagine something impossible. Survival. Maybe even joy. And possibly, just possibly, a little revenge. The first night in the plane, Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat propped against the curved metal wall, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, watching George's chest rise and fall in the darkness. His breathing was ragged, uneven, that damn heart of his doing its chaotic dance. Every irregular beat felt like a countdown she couldn't stop. Whiskers had claimed the pilot's seat, naturally. The cat sat perched on the cracked leather like a tiny furry dictator, surveying his aluminum kingdom. Occasionally, his eyes would catch what little moonlight filtered through the bullet holes, glowing green and judgmental. "You better not die on me, old man," Evelyn whispered into the dark. "Not after dragging me into this metal coffin." George snored in response, which she took as a good sign. Dead men didn't snore. When dawn finally crept through the fuselage, grey and reluctant, Evelyn stood and assessed their situation with the cold practicality that had kept Parker's Fix-It-All running for 50 years. They had shelter, barely. They had each other, barely. They had a cat with an attitude problem. What they didn't have was heat, food, water, or any reasonable explanation for why they thought this was a good idea. "Inventory time," she announced to no one in particular. George stirred, groaning as his joints protested the concrete hard floor. "What time is it?" Time to figure out if we're survivors or idiots. She pulled out their 2 suitcases, dumping the contents onto the cleanest section of floor she could find. 3 changes of clothes each, her cast-iron skillet, the one her grandmother had given her, the one that had cooked 10,000 meals. George's toolbox, bless him, containing a hammer, 2 screwdrivers, pliers, duct tape and a wrench, a box of matches, 6 cans of soup, a bag of cat food, 2 blankets that had seen better decades. "We need fire," George said, scratching his beard. Ice crystals fell from it like dandruff. "Can't make it through another night without heat." "No kidding." Evelyn's voice dripped sarcasm thick enough to insulate the plane. "Any brilliant ideas? Because I don't see a fireplace in this luxury accommodation." But George was already moving, that look on his face again, the one that meant his brain was solving problems in real time. He disappeared toward the back of the plane, his footsteps echoing on metal. When he returned, he was grinning like a madman. "What?" Evelyn demanded. "There's equipment back there, old maintenance gear. And I just remembered Patterson's junkyard is maybe 2 miles east. We passed it on the way here." So, I'm taking a field trip. You stay here with Whiskers, keep warm as you can. I'll be back before noon." Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to tell him his heart couldn't handle a 2-mile hike in sub-zero temperatures. But they both knew complaining wouldn't change reality. Reality didn't care about bad hearts or arthritis or 76-year-old men trudging through snowdrifts. "Take the gloves," she said instead. "And George, don't you dare die out there. I refuse to become a widow in a plane crash that happened 70 years ago." He kissed her forehead, his lips chapped and cold. "Love you too, Evie." Watching him disappear into the white landscape felt like watching a piece of herself walk away. Evelyn distracted herself by exploring their new home more thoroughly. The plane was a C-47, she guessed, based on the configuration. Must have crash-landed or been abandoned decades ago. The cockpit was surprisingly intact, instruments frozen in time, glass cracked but present. The cargo area where they'd slept was the largest space, maybe 20 feet long. Toward the rear, she found what George had mentioned, a smaller compartment that must have been crew quarters, actual walls, even if they were thin aluminum. A tiny space that could maybe, possibly, become something livable. She was measuring the space with her eyes, calculating like she used to calculate shelf dimensions when she heard it. An engine. A vehicle. Evelyn's heart lurched. They were trespassing, squatting. This was someone's land, even if it was abandoned. She grabbed George's hammer from the toolbox, not that she'd actually hit anyone, but it made her feel less helpless, and moved toward the cargo door. A pickup truck, ancient and rusty, idled about 30 yards from the plane. A man climbed out, weathered face mostly hidden behind a beard that rivaled George's. He wore a hunter's orange vest and carried nothing threatening, but Evelyn gripped the hammer anyway. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man called out. His voice was rough, like gravel churned in a cement mixer. "Saw smoke yesterday, figured someone was out here." "There wasn't any smoke yesterday," Evelyn said. Figure of speech. Saw tracks, boot prints. Was curious. He took a few steps closer, moving slow and deliberate like someone approaching a wild animal. "Name's Ray Porter. I hunt these fields sometimes. Been watching this old bird sit here for near about 30 years. "We're not doing any harm," Evelyn said, hating how defensive she sounded. "Just passing through." Ray's eyes shrewd, despite the weathered face took in her threadbare coat, the suitcases visible through the door, the general desperation that must have been radiating off her like heat. "Passing through." "In December. In a crashed plane." He paused. "You're the hardware store folks, aren't you? The Parkers?" Evelyn's grip on the hammer tightened. "What of it?" "Heard what happened. Gerald Morrison's a snake. Always has been. Most of town knows it." Ray reached into his truck bed and pulled out a canvas bag. "Got some firewood. Extra. And some canned goods my wife keeps buying even though we got no room for them." He set the bag down halfway between them and backed away, hands visible. "I'll mind my business. You mind yours. But you're gonna need heat, and this'll get you started." Before Evelyn could respond, before she could process kindness appearing in the shape of a grizzled hunter, Ray climbed back in his truck. But he paused before driving off, window rolled down. "There's a hand pump well about a quarter-mile north, still works far as I know." "And Parker?" He nodded toward her hammer. "If you're gonna threaten folks, hold it like you mean it. You're gripping it like a tennis racket." Then he was gone, leaving only tire tracks and a bag of supplies that felt impossibly heavy with meaning. Evelyn stood there, hammer dangling uselessly, staring at the canvas bag. Inside, firewood, canned stew, beans, a canteen, and tucked at the bottom, a handwritten note. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Ray and Beth Porter." When George returned 2 hours later, dragging a salvaged car hood like a sled loaded with scrap metal, copper tubing, and what appeared to be half a lawnmower, he found Evelyn crying next to a small fire she'd built in the cargo area. Using a ventilation technique she'd improvised with one of the plane's existing ducts. "Evie, what's wrong?" She looked up at him, tears freezing on her cheeks, and laughed. "Nothing's wrong. For the first time in months, absolutely nothing is wrong. Now get over here and show me what kind of miracle you're planning to build with that junk." George grinned, dropped his haul, and got to work. Outside, the Minnesota winter raged on, indifferent and cruel. But inside that broken plane, two people who'd been abandoned by the world were beginning to build something that abandonment couldn't touch. They were building home. By the end of week 2, the plane had transformed from a metal corpse into something that almost resembled civilization. Almost. George's crowning achievement sat in the center of the cargo area like a grotesque sculpture in a modern art museum. A heating stove cobbled together from a lawnmower muffler, copper tubing scavenged from an air conditioning unit, and what Evelyn was 70% sure was part of an old car battery. It shouldn't have worked. It violated probably 17 safety codes and at least 3 laws of physics. But when George lit it up that first time, watching the flame catch and hold, watching actual heat radiate into their frigid aluminum cave, Evelyn could have kissed him. She did kiss him, actually, right there in front of Whiskers, who looked away in feline disgust. "George Parker," she'd said, her arthritic hands finally warm for the first time in weeks, "you're either a genius or we're both about to die in an explosion." "Could be both," he'd replied with that infuriating grin. The stove became their sun, their hearth, their lifeline. George had rigged the ventilation through one of the plane's existing exhaust systems. Apparently the C-47 had been designed with some kind of heating mechanism that had long since died, but the ductwork remained. He'd cleaned it out, reinforced it with scrap metal, and created a chimney effect that actually drew the smoke out through the tail section. "Efficient and dramatic," Evelyn had observed. "We're literally blowing smoke out our ass." George had laughed so hard he'd started coughing, that wet rattling sound that reminded Evelyn his heart was still a ticking time bomb. But for a moment, they'd just been them again, two people who'd spent 50 years making each other laugh in a hardware store that no longer existed. The sleeping situation had improved marginally. Evelyn had borrowed her word, not stolen several moving blankets from a construction site they'd passed on one of George's supply runs. She'd also acquired, through methods she refused to disclose, a roll of genuine insulation foam and enough cardboard to line an entire wall. The crew quarters in the back had become their bedroom, if you could call a 7 by 8 foot aluminum box with a ceiling so low George had to duck a bedroom. But it was theirs. She'd even hung a curtain made from an old tarp, giving them something resembling privacy from Whiskers, who spent most of his time judging them from the cockpit anyway. "We need food that isn't soup," Evelyn announced one morning, watching George doctor their breakfast canned beef stew heated on the flat surface of their Frankenstein stove. "Real food. Vegetables, protein that didn't come in a can with a picture of a happy cow on it." "I could try trapping," George offered. "Ray mentioned there's rabbits in the area." Rabbits. Evelyn stirred her stew, watching it congeal in ways that defied nature. "When I was young, my daddy used to hunt rabbit. Mama would cook it with onions and potatoes. It actually tasted like something." She paused. You ever even fired a gun, George? Once, at a carnival. Lost. Lost at a carnival shooting game. Perfect. Yes, let's definitely trust you with trapping small animals. But George was already sketching something on a piece of cardboard with a pencil stub he'd found. Don't need a gun for traps. Need wire, bait, and patience. I've got wire from the junkyard. We've got stew for bait. And Evie, patience is the only commodity we're not short on. He had a point. Time had become strange in the plain, elastic and meaningless. Without jobs, without schedules, without even a clock, George's watch had died. Week 1 they lived by the sun and their stomachs. Morning was when light filtered through the bullet holes in enough quantity to see. Evening was when you couldn't see anymore. Night was when you huddled close to the stove and tried not to think about your daughter living it up in Scottsdale while you lived in a crashed airplane. Evelyn tried not to think about Melissa. She really did. But at night, when George's breathing finally evened out and Whiskers curled up against her feet, her mind would wander to dangerous places. She'd remember Melissa at 6, gap-toothed and giggly, helping her organize screws at the store. Melissa at 16, rolling her eyes at small-town life, but still showing up for Sunday dinners. Melissa at 25, already distant, but still calling on birthdays. When had the distance become abandonment? When had her daughter, the girl she'd raised, fed, clothed, loved, looked at them and seen disposable? Stop it, George would mumble in his sleep, somehow sensing her spiral, even unconscious. Not worth the energy, Evie. He was right. But pain didn't care about right. On day 16, George caught their first rabbit. He came back to the plane at dusk, holding the animal by its hind legs, looking simultaneously proud and guilty. Thought you should know, I'm naming this one Gerald Morrison before we cook him. Evelyn had snorted so hard she'd nearly choked. Give me that. I'll show you how my mama used to do this. She'd cleaned and prepped that rabbit with the efficiency of someone who'd watched her grandmother do it 100 times, her arthritic hands screaming in protest but moving on muscle memory. They'd cooked it in her cast-iron skillet, the one that had survived every disaster life had thrown at them, and eaten it with their fingers because they only had 2 forks between them, and Whiskers had claimed one for himself. It was the best meal Evelyn had eaten in years. We're gonna make it, George said that night, grease on his beard, satisfaction in his voice. We're actually gonna make it. Evelyn wanted to believe him, but believing felt dangerous, like setting yourself up for another fall. Still, as she looked around their aluminum home, at the stove that shouldn't work but did, at the insulated walls, at the cat grooming himself in the pilot's seat like he owned the damn place, she felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope. Not yet, but maybe hope's cousin. Defiance, perhaps. Determination. The stubborn refusal to die that had kept her ancestors alive through slavery, through Jim Crow, through every systemic attempt to erase them. That same blood ran in her veins, and it was telling her something important. You don't survive by giving up. You survive by being too stubborn to quit. Yeah, she finally answered, settling against George's shoulder. Yeah, we might just make it. Outside, a winter storm was building, the kind that made the weather service issue warnings and sensible people stock up on bread and milk. Inside the plane, 2 people who were well past sensible sat by their impossible stove, full of rabbit named after their betrayer, and felt something they hadn't felt in months. They felt alive. Whiskers meowed from the cockpit, probably demanding tribute or commenting on their sentimentality. Evelyn threw a piece of rabbit in his direction. The cat caught it mid-air with the precision of a trained assassin and disappeared into the shadows to eat it. That cat's gonna outlive us all, George observed. Probably already planning our funerals, Evelyn agreed. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the stove's flames dance through the grated opening George had fashioned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, water collection, more food acquisition, the constant battle against cold. But tonight, they had heat and food and each other. It wasn't much, but for 2 people who'd lost everything, it was enough. For now, It was absolutely enough. The snow came down so hard on day 23 that even Whiskers refused to venture outside. George stood at the cargo door, watching white curtains of ice crystals erase the world, and calculated their supplies with the grim arithmetic of survival. 4 cans of soup, 2 of beans, maybe a week of rabbit if I can get to the traps. If Evelyn looked up from where she was mending a tear in their blanket with thread she'd unraveled from an old shirt. Her fingers moved slowly, each stitch a negotiation with joints that felt like rusted hinges. Ray said storms like this usually last 3-4 days. We'll stretch what we have. And if it lasts longer, then we get creative. Won't be the first time we've made something out of nothing. She bit off the thread with her teeth. Her dental work was another casualty of bankruptcy, and held up the blanket. See? Good as new, well, good as old, good as barely functional. You know what I mean. George smiled, despite the worry gnawing at his chest. This was vintage Evelyn practical pessimism wrapped in dark humor. It's what had made her such a good business partner. While other store owners panicked during slow seasons, Evelyn would simply shrug and say, well, people still need hammers. They'll come eventually. She'd been right then. He hoped she was right now. The storm howled around the plane like a living thing trying to get in. George had reinforced their seals with every material he could find. Foam, cardboard, duct tape, even old newspapers Ray had brought on his last visit. The plane groaned under the wind's assault, metal creaking in ways that made George's engineering instincts scream. But it held. Just like them, the old bird was too stubborn to quit. By day 2 of the storm, they'd run out of things to do except talk. Really talk. The kind of talking they'd been avoiding for weeks because silence was easier than honesty. Do you hate her? George asked suddenly, his voice barely audible over the wind. Evelyn didn't need to ask who. Some days, most days I'm just confused. I keep trying to figure out where we went wrong, what we could have done different. We gave her everything. Maybe that was the problem. Evelyn poked at the stove, watching sparks dance. We worked so hard to make sure she had opportunities we didn't have. College, travel, choices. Maybe we made it too easy. Maybe she never learned what things actually cost. George was quiet for a long moment. I used to think success meant your kids doing better than you, having more, being more. Now I wonder if we just raised her to think she was entitled to more, to better, to something beyond us. Beyond us, Evelyn repeated bitterly. That's exactly what she got, isn't it? So far beyond us she couldn't even see us anymore. The stove crackled. Whiskers, sensing the heavy mood, jumped down from his throne and curled up between them, a rare gesture of solidarity from a cat who specialized in emotional detachment. I keep thinking about that last phone call, George said. When she told us about the assisted living facility, she made it sound so reasonable, so practical. You can't keep running the store, Dad. Mom's arthritis is getting worse. You need somewhere with medical staff, activities, a community. Like we were broken toys she needed to warehouse. She wasn't wrong about her struggling, Evelyn said quietly. We were drowning, George. Between Gerald stealing from us and the medical bills and our bodies falling apart. But we were drowning together. In our home. In our life. George's voice cracked. She took that choice away from us. Sold everything, took the money, and decided she knew better. With Brad, Evelyn added, venom dripping from the name. Brad, who sells digital pictures of dolphins. Brad, who convinced her that her elderly parents' life savings was better invested in cryptocurrency than, I don't know, maybe helping her elderly parents. George laughed, harsh and sharp. You think she knows about us being here? In a crashed plane in a field? Living on trapped rabbits and stolen insulation? No. Evelyn shook her head. She probably thinks we're in some facility somewhere, playing bingo and slowly dying of boredom. That's if she thinks about us at all. The wind shrieked, and something metal tore loose outside, maybe part of the wing flap George hadn't been able to secure. The sound was like the plane screaming. We should have fought harder, George said. When she started the paperwork, when she brought those lawyers, we should have... What? We were exhausted, George. Broken. Gerald had just stolen everything. You were having chest pains every other day. I couldn't open a jar without pain shooting up my arms. Evelyn's voice turned fierce. She counted on that. On us being too tired to fight. That's what makes it so unforgivable. They sat with that truth, heavy as the snow piling up outside. Whiskers purred between them, oblivious or uncaring. Probably uncaring. He was a cat, after all. I miss the store, George said eventually. Is that stupid? Everything else we lost and I miss the store. It's not stupid. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. The store was us, 50 years of us. Every nail we sold, every customer we helped, every Saturday morning we opened together. It was proof we built something. That we mattered. We still matter. Do we? To who? The question came out harsher than Evelyn intended. We don't have family, we don't have a business, we don't even have an address anymore. We're squatting in a crashed plane, George. We're ghosts. Ghosts don't eat rabbit, George pointed out. Ghosts don't build stoves from lawnmower parts. And ghosts definitely don't have a cat with an attitude problem. Despite herself, Evelyn smiled. Fair point. The storm raged on, day bleeding into night, bleeding into day again. They rationed their food, making 1 can of soup last 2 meals by adding water, lots of water, until it was more idea of soup than actual soup. George ventured out once, on day 3, roped to the plane like a mountaineer, and managed to check 1 trap, empty. The rabbit apparently had more sense than they did about weather. On day 4, the wind finally stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise, like the world holding its breath, waiting to see what came next. George opened the cargo door to a landscape transformed. Snow had drifted against the plane in waves, some nearly reaching the wings. The field was pristine, unmarked, blinding white under a weak sun that looked exhausted from its own absence. Beautiful, Evelyn said, standing beside him, and deadly. Story of Minnesota, George agreed. They were down to 1 can of beans and pride when they heard it. An engine. Not Ray's familiar truck, but something smaller. An ATV, maybe. The sound grew closer, and then they saw him, Ray, on a 4-wheeler, pulling a small sled, bundled up like an Arctic explorer. He killed the engine about 20 yards out and trudged through the snow toward them. Figured you two might be getting hungry. The sled contained 5 cans of stew, a loaf of bread, a container of Beth's homemade chili, a bag of cat food, and a bottle of whiskey. The whiskey's medicinal, Ray said gruffly. Helps with everything, according to my grandfather. Evelyn's eyes burned. She refused to cry in front of anyone except George, but it was a close thing. We can't pay you back. Didn't ask you to. Ray shifted uncomfortably, clearly not a man comfortable with gratitude. Beth says to tell you she's got extra blankets if you need them, and I brought something else. He pulled a battery-operated radio from his coat. Thought you might want to know what's happening in the world. Gets lonely out here, I expect. After Ray left, they sat by the stove, eating chili that tasted like heaven, listening to the radio play old country music interspersed with news about weather patterns and local events. It was the first time in weeks they'd felt connected to anything beyond their aluminum shell. People know, George said suddenly, about us being here. Ray knows, Beth knows, probably others. And they're not turning us in, Evelyn spooned chili, savoring each bite. They're helping. Small town Minnesota, George said. They'll gossip about you, judge you, and bring you casseroles all at the same time. Better than what our own daughter did. The words hung there, undeniable and awful. Strangers were treating them with more humanity than their own blood. It should have felt worse than it did. Instead, it felt almost liberating, like severing an infected limb. Painful, necessary, and ultimately healing. That night, warmed by chili and whiskey and the knowledge that they weren't completely alone, Evelyn and George slept better than they had in months. Outside, the Minnesota winter continued its assault, indifferent and eternal. But inside their plane, 2 people who'd been abandoned were learning a fundamental truth. Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's a gruff hunter and his wife. Sometimes it's a cat with boundary issues. Sometimes it's the person who's been beside you for 50 years, still here, still fighting, still refusing to quit. Sometimes that's enough. January arrived with the subtlety of a freight train, dragging sub-zero temperatures and the kind of cold that made your teeth ache just thinking about going outside. But the Parkers had settled into a rhythm, the kind of routine that emerges when survival becomes lifestyle. George woke first every morning, had for 50 years, wasn't about to stop now, and coaxed the stove back to life from its overnight simmer. Evelyn would emerge from their curtained quarters 15 minutes later, moving slow while her joints remembered how to bend. Whiskers supervised from the cockpit, occasionally offering commentary in the form of judgmental meows. Breakfast was whatever they had. Coffee was a memory they mourned like a deceased relative. "I'd kill for a cup of coffee," Evelyn said one morning, not for the first time. "Real coffee, not this hot water with delusions of grandeur." George looked up from the can of peaches. He was opening their luxury item this week, courtesy of Ray's latest supply drop. "What would you actually kill? Like, if someone said, murder this specific thing and you get coffee, what would you choose?" Evelyn considered this seriously. "A mosquito. Maybe a fly. I'm not above insect murder for caffeine." "What about Brad?" She laughed, sharp and surprised. "Brad doesn't deserve the honor of being connected to good coffee. Brad gets decaf, instant decaf, the kind that tastes like dirt and regret." They'd started doing this, making jokes about Melissa and Brad, about their situation, about everything. It was either laugh or scream, and screaming used too much energy. Besides, humor was the only weapon they had left, and they wielded it like veterans. George had improved the plane steadily over the weeks. He'd reinforced the cargo door so it actually closed properly. He'd created a washing system using collected snow melted on the stove and a basin he'd fashioned from a satellite dish he'd found in Patterson's junkyard. He'd even managed to rig up a kind of shelf system along one wall, using metal brackets and wooden planks, giving them actual storage space. "We're gentrifying this plane," Evelyn had observed, watching him work. "Soon we'll be charging rent." But it was Evelyn's touch that made it feel less like survival and more like living. She'd organized their supplies with the precision of her hardware store days, everything labeled and sorted. She'd created a kitchen area around the stove, with their cooking implements hung on hooks George had installed. She'd even found a way to make the space feel less cold, literally and figuratively, by covering the metal walls with fabric scraps and cardboard, creating insulation and something approaching decoration. The piece de resistance was the sign George had painted on the exterior of the plane one afternoon when the sun was actually visible. In drippy white spray paint, letters 3 feet tall: "Flight 0, final destination, still here." Ray had seen it on his next visit and laughed so hard he'd needed to sit down. "You two are certifiably insane." "I love it." "We're not insane," Evelyn had corrected. "We're just beyond the point of caring what anyone thinks." "That's the definition of insane, Parker." "No, that's the definition of freedom." By mid-January, they'd had more visitors than just Ray. Word had spread in that mysterious way small-town information travels faster than internet, more reliable than newspapers. The crazy old hardware folks were living in that crashed plane off Patterson's land. Different people reacted differently. Some drove by slowly, gawking like they were viewing zoo animals. George started waving at them enthusiastically, which made Evelyn laugh every time. Others stopped to help. A farmer named Jim brought them firewood and didn't ask questions. A woman from church, not the church whose pastor Whiskers had scratched, a different church, left a box of canned goods by the plane with a note: "Praying for you. Also, my husband says you're either crazy or geniuses. I think both. Karen." And then there was the morning a beat-up Honda pulled up and a young guy with purple hair and about 15 facial piercings climbed out. He couldn't have been more than 25, looked like he belonged in a Minneapolis coffee shop, not a Minnesota cornfield. "Are you the plane people?" he called out. George, who'd been outside reinforcing the tail section, straightened up. "Depends on who's asking. I'm Tyler. I'm a journalism student at the University of Minnesota. I heard about you guys from my aunt. She's friends with Beth Porter. Anyway, I'm wondering if you'd let me interview you for a story I'm working on." Evelyn appeared in the doorway, suspicious by default. "What kind of story?" "About alternative living situations. About people who've been pushed out of traditional housing. About," he paused, seeming to weigh his words, "about how society treats elderly people who don't fit the mold." "Mold," Evelyn repeated. "That's diplomatic. You mean how society throws us away like expired milk?" Tyler didn't flinch. "Yeah, that's exactly what I mean." They invited him inside, mostly because it was too cold to stand around talking. Tyler's eyes went wide as he took in their setup, the Frankenstein stove, the organized chaos, the cat in the pilot's seat, wearing what appeared to be a tiny scarf Evelyn had knitted from unraveled yarn. "This is incredible," he breathed. "You built all this?" "Built is generous," George said. "We MacGyvered it. There's a difference." For the next 2 hours, Tyler asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He wanted to know about the store, about Gerald's betrayal, about Melissa. That last part was hard, but Evelyn found herself telling the truth, all of it. How her daughter had systematically dismantled their life under the guise of help. How she'd vanished with a man who sold cryptocurrency featuring marine mammals. How the last communication they'd received was a text message, "You'll be better off, trust me." "I don't trust her," Evelyn said flatly. "I don't even recognize her anymore. The girl I raised would never—" She stopped, shook her head. "But maybe I didn't really know her. Maybe we never do with our kids. Maybe they're just strangers we love." Tyler was writing furiously, his pen moving across a physical notebook. "Can I ask, and you can absolutely say no, but would you be willing to be photographed for the story?" George and Evelyn exchanged looks. A whole conversation happened in that glance, the kind only possible after 50 years together. "Why not?" George finally said. "We're already living in a plane, might as well document the insanity." Tyler came back 2 days later with a photographer, a quiet woman named Sam, who treated their plane like it was the most normal home she'd ever visited. She took pictures of everything. The stove, the organized supplies, Whiskers looking regal in the cockpit, George and Evelyn standing outside the plane beneath the "Still Here" sign. "These are going to be powerful," Sam said, reviewing her shots. "The juxtaposition of—" She stopped. "Sorry, artist, speak. What I mean is, you two are amazing." After they left, Evelyn felt strange, exposed, like they'd opened a door that couldn't be closed again. "You think this was a mistake?" she asked George that night. "I think it's too late to worry about it now." He poked the fire, sending sparks dancing. "Besides, maybe someone needs to hear it. Maybe some other old person out there is being screwed over by their kids and thinking they're alone. Maybe knowing we're here, surviving, matters." "Getting philosophical in your old age." "Always been philosophical. You just never listened." She threw a balled-up sock at him. He caught it with one hand and grinned. 3 weeks later, Tyler came back with printed copies of the article. It ran in the university paper, but also got picked up by a couple of regional outlets. The headline read, "Love in the Wreckage, How Two Seniors Turned Abandonment into Adventure." Evelyn read it twice, her eyes burning. Tyler had captured everything. The betrayal, the survival, the dark humor they used like armor. But he'd also captured something else, their resilience. Their refusal to be victims, the way they'd taken the absolute worst situation and built something that resembled joy. There was one paragraph near the end that hit her especially hard. When asked if they'd go back to traditional housing if given the chance, Evelyn Parker didn't hesitate. "Why would we? Out here, nobody's telling us we're too old, too broken, too inconvenient. Out here, we're just two people who refuse to quit. That's worth more than any building with 4 walls and a working toilet." "I sound crazy," Evelyn said. "You sound honest," George corrected. Within days, something unexpected started happening. Letters arrived, left at the plane by Ray, who'd apparently become their unofficial postman. Letters from people across Minnesota, across the country even, saying the article had resonated. Some were from other elderly people dealing with similar situations. Others were from younger people who'd watched their parents or grandparents get warehoused against their will. One letter, from a woman in Milwaukee, said, "Reading about you two made me realize I've been treating my father like he's already dead just because he's old. Thank you for the wake-up call." Another, from a man in Duluth, "Your daughter doesn't deserve you, but for what it's worth, the rest of us see you. We know you matter." Evelyn kept every letter in a box George made from scrap wood. She didn't talk about them much, but George would catch her rereading them sometimes, lips moving silently, eyes distant. "People care," she said one night, holding the box like it was precious. "Strangers care more than our own daughter." "Says something about strangers," George replied. "Says more about our daughter." Outside, another winter storm was building. They could feel it in the air, that electric pressure that meant snow was coming. But inside their plane, warmed by their impossible stove and surrounded by letters from people who saw them as human beings worthy of dignity, George and Evelyn Parker felt something they hadn't felt in a very long time. They felt seen. And sometimes, being seen is all the fuel you need to keep the fire burning. The news crew arrived on a Tuesday morning in late January, their white van crawling through the snow like a cautious animal approaching something it didn't quite understand. George spotted them first, squinting through the morning light while checking his rabbit traps. "Evie, we've got company, the fancy kind." Evelyn emerged from the plane, wiping her hands on her apron, the one she'd sewn from old army tarp that George had found half buried near the tail section. It was ugly as sin, but functional, which was pretty much their life philosophy at this point. "Fancy how? TV van," says Channel 7 News on the side. "Lord have mercy." Evelyn's hand went to her hair, which she'd been twisting into its usual knot. "I look like I've been living in a crashed airplane." "You have been living in a crashed airplane." "That's not the point, George." But there was no time for primping. A woman in a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than the Parkers had spent on clothes in the last decade was already picking her way through the snow, followed by a cameraman and a guy carrying sound equipment. The woman's heels, actual heels, in this weather kept sinking into the drifts. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," she had that newscaster voice, smooth and artificially warm. "I'm Vanessa Chen from Channel 7. We saw the article about you in the university paper, and we'd love to do a segment. Would you be willing to talk with us?" Evelyn looked at George. George looked at Evelyn. Whiskers, who'd appeared in the cargo door opening, looked at all of them with supreme disdain. "Sure," George finally said, "but fair warning, we're weird, we're blunt, and our cat judges everyone." Vanessa's professional smile brightened into something more genuine. "Perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for." What followed was the strangest morning of the Parkers' already strange new life. The crew set up cameras, checked lighting, discussed angles. Meanwhile, Evelyn went about her normal routine because she'd be damned if some TV people were going to disrupt her breakfast schedule. She fried up the squirrel George had caught the previous day in her cast-iron skillet, right there on their weird stove, while the cameras rolled. "Mrs. Parker, what are you cooking?" Vanessa asked. Microphone extended. "Squirrel, shot it yesterday. Well, George trapped it. Same difference." Evelyn flipped the meat with the ease of someone who'd cooked approximately 10,000 meals in her lifetime. "Tastes like chicken if you don't think about it too hard." The cameraman's eyes went wide. The sound guy tried to hide a smile. "And you're cooking on? Is that made from a lawnmower?" "Partially," George chimed in, appearing from outside where he'd been reinforcing the wing struts with what looked like stolen scaffolding. "Also got some copper tubing from an AC unit, battery components, and pure spite. It's a hybrid." Vanessa recovered quickly. "You didn't get to be a news anchor without learning to roll with chaos. Can you walk us through how you ended up here?" So they did. George explained about the store, the embezzlement, the medical bills. Evelyn talked about Melissa in a tone so calm and detached it was scarier than anger. She explained the whole thing, the promises of modern assisted living, the sold house, the drained accounts, the man named Brad who sold NFTs shaped like dolphins. "I'm sorry," Vanessa interrupted. "Dolphin NFTs? Digital dolphins," Evelyn clarified, her voice dripping with enough sarcasm to rust metal. Because apparently, imaginary pictures of marine mammals are more valuable than taking care of the people who raised you. But what do I know? I just sold screws for 50 years. The interview went on for over an hour. They showed the crew everything, the sleeping quarters, the storage system, the washing setup, even Whiskers' domain in the cockpit. George demonstrated how the stove worked, explaining his modifications with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely loved problem-solving, even when the problem was how not to freeze to death. At one point, Vanessa asked the question everyone seemed to want answered. If you could go back, have a traditional home again, running water, heat, all the things most people consider necessary, would you? Evelyn was stirring their morning coffee-adjacent hot beverage when the question came. She stopped, spoon hovering over the cup, really thinking about it. You know what traditional housing costs, she finally said. It costs accepting that you're obsolete, that you need managing, that you can't be trusted with your own decisions anymore. She set down the spoon with deliberate care. Out here, nobody's telling me I'm too old or too broken or too inconvenient. Nobody's selling my life out from under me. Yeah, it's cold. Yeah, we're eating squirrel. But we're free. That's worth more than central heating. George, who'd been silently reinforcing her point through his presence, added, for the first time in months, nobody's telling us what to do. Nobody's making decisions for us. Nobody's treating us like we're already dead just because our bodies are old. We're not surviving, we're living. There's a difference. The cameraman, a younger guy who'd been mostly silent, spoke up suddenly. My grandmother's in a home. She hates it. She tells me every time I visit, but the family says it's for her own good. Watching you two. I don't know. Makes me wonder if we're the ones who need help, not her. Trust your grandmother, Evelyn said firmly. Old people know things. That's literally the only benefit of getting old. You accumulate knowledge. Ignoring that knowledge because it's inconvenient is just stupid. Vanessa, to her credit, let them speak without sugarcoating anything. When the interview wrapped, she actually seemed moved, her professional veneer cracked enough to show real emotion. This is going to air tomorrow night, she said. Prime time, I think. She paused, choosing words carefully. I think a lot of people need to hear this. After they left, Evelyn collapsed onto their makeshift furniture, a bench George had built from cargo pallets. Was that real? Did we just get interviewed by actual television? While you cooked squirrel and I explained our lawnmower stove. George sat beside her. We're either about to become famous or the laughingstock of Minnesota. Could be both, Evelyn said, echoing his words from weeks ago. Whiskers jumped down from his perch and rubbed against Evelyn's legs, his version of comfort or possibly just manipulation for food. Hard to tell with cats. The segment aired the next evening at 6 o'clock. They knew because Ray showed up with a tablet, already loaded with the channel, and propped it up on their shelf system. Beth made me promise to show you, he said gruffly, said you need to see how you come across. They gathered around the small screen George, Evelyn, Ray and Whiskers, who seemed interested in the glowing rectangle. The segment opened with dramatic aerial footage of the plane, half buried in snow, looking simultaneously majestic and absurd. Then cut to Vanessa's voiceover. In a field outside Millbrook Creek, two people are redefining what it means to age with dignity. What followed was 12 minutes of the rawest, most honest television Evelyn had ever seen. They didn't edit out the squirrel cooking. They didn't soften Evelyn's comments about Melissa. They showed everything: the stove, the cramped quarters, George's jerry-rigged repairs, Whiskers judging from the cockpit. But they also showed the love, the way George and Evelyn moved around each other with practiced ease, the laughter, the resilience. The segment ended with Evelyn's quote about freedom being worth more than central heating, and then a final shot, both of them standing outside the plane beneath George's spray-painted sign. Flight 0, final destination, still here. The screen faded to black. Ray cleared his throat, suspiciously emotional for a man who'd once shot a bear with a .22 and never mentioned it again. That was something. We look crazy, Evelyn said. You look free, Ray corrected. There's a difference. The segment went viral by the next morning. Ray showed up at noon with his tablet again, this time showing them YouTube views, social media shares, comment sections full of people arguing about elder care and family responsibility and American dreams turned nightmares. Some comments were supportive. These two are heroes. This is what real love looks like. Someone adopt these people, please. Others were critical. This is sad, not inspiring. They need help, not celebration. Where are the social services? And then there were the comments about Melissa. Oh, the comments about Melissa. The internet, in its infinite wisdom and cruelty, had decided she was public enemy number one. People were trying to find her, calling her out, demanding she respond. Should we feel bad? George asked, reading through the comments with a mixture of fascination and horror. Ask me when I'm dead, Evelyn replied. Right now, I'm just grateful people care. But caring came with complications. By week's end, they had a problem. Too much help. Donations started arriving. Money, supplies, offers to build them a real house. A construction company from Minneapolis wanted to relocate them to a tiny home they'd built specifically for them. A retirement community offered them a free apartment. 3 different families invited them to live as their guests. Someone started a GoFundMe that raised $40,000 in 4 days. And then the government showed up. Not literally the government, more like government adjacent. A woman from social services, a man from the county health department, someone from the Minnesota Department of Transportation, who seemed confused about why he'd been sent. They arrived in separate cars, but with unified purpose, concern. Mr. and Mrs. Parker, the social services woman began, her voice kind but firm in that way that meant she'd already made up her mind. We've seen the news coverage. We're worried about your safety. Living in an abandoned aircraft in sub-zero temperatures isn't sustainable. We've sustained it pretty well so far, George interrupted, and we'd like to help you find more appropriate housing. There are resources available, programs designed specifically for seniors in crisis. We're not in crisis, Evelyn cut in, her voice sharp. We were in crisis when our daughter stole everything. We were in crisis when we were homeless. Now, we've got shelter, food, heat, and our dignity. That's not crisis, that's winning. The health department guy cleared his throat. There are sanitation concerns. No running water, no proper waste disposal. We've got a waste system, George said flatly. It works fine. Better than my digestive system, honestly. And the structure itself is unsound. It's not designed for habitation. Neither is a cardboard box. Evelyn snapped, but thousands of people live in those. At least our plane has a roof and walls, and we're not begging on street corners. What exactly is your point? The meeting went downhill from there. The officials meant well, Evelyn could acknowledge that later, in calmer moments, but they represented everything she and George had been running from. The idea that someone else knew better, that their choices were wrong simply because they were unconventional, that old people needed managing like children. Finally, the social services woman played her card. If you refuse assistance, we may need to evaluate whether you're competent to make decisions for yourselves. The temperature, in the plane already cold, seemed to drop another 20 degrees. Get out, Evelyn said quietly. Mrs. Parker. Get out. Louder now. We're not your problem to solve. We're not incompetent. We're not a burden. We're 2 people who got screwed over and found a way to survive, and if that makes you uncomfortable, that's your issue, not ours. They left, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. George paced the plane after they'd gone, his face darker than Evelyn had seen in years. They're going to try to take us, he said, force us into some facility where we'll die slowly of boredom and despair, all while they pat themselves on the back for helping. Evelyn felt something hardening in her chest. The same thing that had kept her going through 5 decades of retail hell, through bankruptcy, through betrayal. Pure, undiluted stubbornness. Let them try, she said. We've survived worse than bureaucrats with good intentions. We'll survive this too. But as night fell and they huddled by their stove, both of them felt it, the pressure building, the world closing in. They'd gone viral, gotten attention, and now that attention was becoming a cage. Freedom, apparently, made people nervous. And nervous people did stupid things. The knock came 3 days later, early morning, loud enough to wake Whiskers from his perpetual nap. George was already outside, checking the integrity of the fuselage after another brutal night of wind. Evelyn, still wrapped in every blanket they owned, shuffled to the cargo door with the enthusiasm of someone being summoned to their own execution. She expected social services. She expected more well-meaning bureaucrats with clipboards and condescension. She did not expect a man in a long black coat and aviator sunglasses standing next to a sleek SUV that looked like it cost more than their entire life savings used to be worth. Mrs. Parker. His voice was smooth, professional, the kind of voice that sold timeshares and bad ideas. My name is Richard Castellano. I represent the Department of Historical Aviation. May I have a moment of your time? Evelyn crossed her arms. That depends. Are you here to tell us we're crazy and need to be institutionalized? A flicker of amusement crossed his face. No, ma'am. I'm here to tell you that you're living on government property. The words hit like a physical blow. George, hearing the exchange, came around from the tail section, still holding the wrench he'd been using. Government property, he repeated flatly. I'm afraid so. Castellano pulled out a tablet, swiping through documents with practiced efficiency. This C-47 Skytrain was decommissioned in 1954 after serving in both World War II and the Korean conflict. It was sold to a private owner who intended to restore it, but after he passed away, the transfer of ownership was never properly completed. Technically, it reverted to federal holdings. And the land it's on, he gestured around, was recently purchased by Northwoods Development Corporation. They're planning to break ground on a luxury ski resort this spring. Evelyn felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, not metaphorically. Actually tilt, like the whole world had decided up was down and gravity was negotiable. A ski resort, she said, her voice eerily calm. You're telling me someone's turning this frozen hellscape into a vacation destination for rich people? The area has excellent elevation for skiing. The views are spectacular, and with the right development. When? George interrupted, his jaw tight. When do they break ground? Castellano had the decency to look uncomfortable. April 1st. They'll need to clear the site, which means removing the aircraft. I'm sorry, Mr. Parker, but you'll need to relocate by March 15th. We're prepared to offer assistance with... Assistance. The word came out of Evelyn like poison. Everyone wants to help us. Nobody wants to leave us alone. Mrs. Parker, I understand this is difficult. Do you? She stepped closer, all 5'3" of her radiating fury. Do you understand what it's like to lose everything? To have your own daughter strip you of your dignity and your savings? To be told over and over that you're too old, too broken, too inconvenient to make your own choices? And then, when you finally find something that works, have someone show up and say, sorry, you can't have this either. Castellano opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to be recalculating his approach. George, meanwhile, was thinking. Evelyn could see it in his face, that look he got when solving complex problems at the hardware store. The look that had kept them in business for 50 years despite every obstacle. Who owns Northwoods Development? George asked suddenly. A company called Summit Ventures. They specialize in luxury rural tourism, and they know about us, about the viral story, about the plane. Castellano hesitated. Yes. So they know this site has name recognition now, novelty, the kind of thing that brings tourists. George's eyes narrowed. What if we made them an offer? George, Evelyn started. No, hear me out. He turned to Castellano. You said they want to build a ski resort. Something unique, right? Something that stands out in a market full of generic lodges? I suppose, but what if they kept the plane, built around it, made it part of the resort, a heritage suite, a piece of living history. People eat that stuff up. George was warming to his idea now, pacing in the snow. And who better to run it than the people who've been living in it? We know every inch of this aircraft. We've got a story that's already viral. We'd be the perfect hosts. Evelyn stared at her husband like he'd grown a second head. You want to work for the people trying to evict us? I want to not be evicted, George corrected. And I want them to pay us for the privilege of using our story. Castellano was quiet for a long moment, his professional mask slipping to reveal something more calculating. That's actually not a terrible idea, but I can't make that decision. You'd need to speak with Summit Ventures directly. Set up a meeting, George said immediately. I'm not authorized to. Then get authorized. George's voice turned hard, the tone he used to use with suppliers trying to screw them on orders. Because here's the alternative. We refuse to leave. You try to remove us, it becomes a news story. Elderly couple forcibly evicted from plane they turned into home. That kind of publicity? That's not great for a luxury resort trying to court wealthy tourists. Bad optics. Evelyn watched her husband negotiate like he was back at the hardware store, haggling over bulk orders and delivery schedules, and felt something fierce and proud surge in her chest. This man, this stubborn, brilliant, infuriating man who'd stuck with her through everything. Castellano made a phone call. Then another. He walked away from them, voice low, occasionally glancing back at George and Evelyn standing in front of their aluminum home like sentries guarding a castle. 20 minutes later, he returned. Someone from Summit Ventures will be here tomorrow at 2 o'clock. They're interested in hearing your proposal. After he left, Evelyn turned to George. Are you out of your mind? Probably. He grinned, that reckless smile she'd fallen in love with 53 years ago. But Evie, think about it. We get to stay. We get paid. And every rich person who books that rustic heritage suite has to hear our story, has to know what we survived. That's not losing. That's winning on our terms. It's working for the people trying to kick us out. It's turning the people trying to kick us out into people who need us. He took her hands, his rough palms warm against her arthritic knuckles. We've spent our whole lives adapting, Evie, adapting to the market, to competition, to Gerald's theft, to Melissa's betrayal. This is just one more adaptation. Except this time, we're negotiating from strength. She wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways this could go wrong. But looking at George's face, alive and animated in a way she hadn't seen since before the store closed, she couldn't bring herself to crush that hope. Fine, she finally said. But I'm doing the talking. You get too excited and give away the whole store. Yes, ma'am. They spent the rest of the day preparing. George cleaned the plane more thoroughly than it had been cleaned in 70 years, clearing debris, organizing their supplies, making everything look intentional rather than desperate. Evelyn, meanwhile, made lists. Terms they'd accept, terms they wouldn't. What they needed versus what they wanted. Ray showed up around sunset with supplies and gossip. Heard you're negotiating with Summit Ventures. News travels fast, George said. It's Millbrook Creek. News travels before it happens. Ray set down his delivery fresh bread from Beth, canned goods, and mysteriously a tie. Beth says you should look professional. I told her you're negotiating from a crashed plane, but she insisted. George held up the tie like it was a dead snake. I haven't worn one of these since our daughter's college graduation. Don't remind me of that day, Evelyn muttered. She spent the whole ceremony on her phone. The meeting was set for 2 o'clock the next day, but people started arriving at noon. First came Tyler, the journalism student, with his camera. This is a follow-up story I can't miss. Then Vanessa Chen and her news crew. We'd like to cover the negotiation, if you're comfortable with that. Then a cluster of locals, Jim the farmer, Karen from the other church, even the game warden who'd once brought them a pity pie. They stood at a respectful distance, like witnesses to history or a really weird town hall meeting. At exactly 2 o'clock, 3 SUVs pulled up. Out stepped 5 people in expensive coats and polished shoes completely inappropriate for a Minnesota field. The lead man was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of confident swagger that came from never being told no. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker, I'm Jonathan Wright, CEO of Summit Ventures." He extended his hand. George shook it, noting the firm grip, the Rolex watch. "I understand you have a proposal for us." "We do," George said. "Let's talk inside." Wright looked at the plane with barely concealed skepticism. "Inside the aircraft? It's warmer than out here," Evelyn said sweetly. "Unless you'd prefer to freeze while we negotiate." They filed into the cargo area. Wright and 2 of his associates, George and Evelyn, and Whiskers, who'd positioned himself in the cockpit like a furry CEO overseeing a board meeting. The news cameras stayed outside, filming through the windows. Wright looked around, taking in the stove, the organization, the sheer improbability of it all. "I'll admit, this is impressive. Not remotely to code, probably violating about 40 safety regulations, but impressive." "We're not here to discuss building codes," George said. "We're here to discuss a business opportunity." And then he pitched. Not the desperate plea of people with no options, but the confident presentation of people with something valuable to offer. He talked about their viral story, the national attention, the unique angle a heritage suite would bring to a luxury resort. He mentioned authenticity, marketing opportunities, the kind of experiential tourism wealthy people would pay premium rates for. Evelyn jumped in with specifics. They'd run the suite, manage bookings, provide breakfasts, share their story with guests. In return, they wanted a legitimate contract, fair wages, housing the plane itself, properly winterized and maintained, and a percentage of the suite's revenue. "And," Evelyn added, her voice hard, "we want it in writing that this is our home. Not just employment. You're not landlords, you're business partners. We're not tenants you can evict when it's convenient. We're integral to the experience you're selling." Wright was quiet for a long moment. His associates whispered among themselves. Outside, the crowd had grown more townspeople, more cameras, more witnesses. Finally, Wright smiled. Not a warm smile, but a calculating one. The smile of someone who'd just realized they could turn a problem into profit. "Captain George's crash pad," he said suddenly. "What?" "That's what we'll call it. Captain George's crash pad, a heritage suite experience. You'll be Captain George, she'll be..." He looked at Evelyn. "First Officer Evelyn," she supplied dryly, "because I actually keep this operation running." Wright's smile widened. "Perfect, absolutely perfect. We'll winterize the aircraft properly, extend utilities, maybe add a small addition for a proper bathroom. You'll run it, host guests, share your story. We'll market it as exclusive, only available by reservation, premium pricing. Rustic luxury meets human resilience. And our terms?" George pressed. "We'll need our lawyers to draft a formal agreement, but in principle, yes. You'll have housing for life, a percentage of revenue, and creative control over the guest experience." He stood, extended his hand again. "Welcome to the Summit Ventures family, Captain." George took his hand, then pulled Evelyn close. "We're a package deal. Both captains or no deal." "Co-captains," Wright agreed. "Even better, more egalitarian." They signed preliminary documents right there, on a piece of plywood serving as George's workbench, witnessed by news cameras and half of Millbrook Creek. When it was done, the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Ray was grinning. "You crazy bastards actually pulled it off." "Language," Beth scolded, appearing beside him with a casserole dish. "But yes, congratulations, you crazy bastards." That night, alone in their plane, their home, now guaranteed, George and Evelyn sat by their stove and processed what had just happened. "We basically extorted a development company into giving us jobs," Evelyn said. "We negotiated a fair compensation for our labor and story," George corrected. "Same thing. No, one sounds illegal. The other sounds smart." Evelyn laughed, the sound echoing off the metal walls. "Melissa's going to lose her mind when she finds out." Good, George said. Let her. Let her see that we didn't need her, that we survived without her, that we thrived, actually. And somewhere in Arizona, in a condo bought with stolen money, Melissa Parker probably was seeing the news. Probably was realizing that her parents, the ones she'd written off as obsolete, had just become minor celebrities with guaranteed housing and income. But in Minnesota, in a plane that refused to surrender, two people who'd lost everything were winning. Not despite their circumstances, but because of how they'd faced them. We're going to need employee uniforms, Evelyn said suddenly. God help us all, George replied. Whiskers meowed from the cockpit, probably in agreement. Spring came to Minnesota the way it always did, reluctantly, suspiciously, like it might change its mind at any moment and retreat back into winter. But by mid-March, the snow had started its slow surrender, revealing the brown earth beneath and all the things that had been buried for months. The plane looked different now. Summit Ventures had sent contractors carefully vetted by George, who trusted them about as far as he could throw their equipment to winterize the aircraft properly. They'd added insulation that actually met building codes, extended electricity from a generator setup, and built a small addition off the rear that contained an actual bathroom with running water and a shower that Evelyn had nearly wept over the first time she used it. Hot water, she'd said, standing under the spray like she was baptized. George, there's hot water that doesn't come from melting snow on a lawnmower stove. Progress, he'd agreed from outside the bathroom. Weird, uncomfortable progress. But they'd been careful to preserve the plane's character. The stove George had built stayed non-functional now, but kept as a conversation piece. The organized chaos of their survival setup remained visible in strategic places. The spray-painted sign stayed exactly where it was. And Whiskers, naturally, kept his throne in the cockpit, now fitted with an actual cushion courtesy of Beth Porter. The grand opening of Captain George's crash pad was scheduled for May 1st, timed to coincide with the ski resort's official launch. In the meantime, George and Evelyn had to transform from survivors into hospitality professionals. We need to practice, Evelyn announced one morning, consulting a notebook where she'd been writing down ideas. Practice hosting. Practice telling our story without sounding bitter. I am bitter, George pointed out. Yes, but we can't lead with that. We need to ease guests into our bitterness, like slowly heating water so the frog doesn't notice. Are we the frog or the water in this metaphor? We're the ones cooking the frog. The guests are the frog. Keep up, George. They practiced on Ray and Beth first, inviting them over for a trial breakfast experience. Evelyn had been working on her cooking, actual cooking, with actual ingredients from an actual refrigerator that Summit Ventures had installed. She'd almost forgotten what it was like to have eggs that weren't frozen solid or vegetables that weren't from a can. She made pancakes, bacon, scrambled eggs with cheese, set it all on a folding table George had refinished, even found wildflowers to put in a jar as a centerpiece. This is weird, Ray said, sitting at the table in the cargo bay. I've been bringing you survival supplies for months, and now you're serving me pancakes with garnish. The garnish is parsley, Evelyn said. I grew it in a pot by the window. We have windows now. It's disorienting. Beth smiled, pouring syrup with precision. You two are going to be wonderful at this. You've got the story, you've got the personality, and Lord knows you've got the survival skills to handle any guest emergency. What kind of emergencies happen at luxury resorts? George asked. Rich people, emergencies, Ray said. Like the Wi-Fi being slow or the champagne not being cold enough. We don't have Wi-Fi, Evelyn said. That's going to be their first emergency then. After Ray and Beth left pronouncing the trial breakfast a success, George found Evelyn sitting in the cockpit with Whiskers, staring out at the field that had almost killed them and then saved them. You okay? He asked. I keep thinking about November, she said quietly. When we had nothing. When we were so cold I couldn't feel my fingers. When I genuinely thought we might not make it. She stroked Whiskers, who tolerated the affection with his usual disdain. And now we're preparing to host wealthy tourists in our home. It's surreal. Surreal is better than frozen. Is it though? She turned to look at him. Sometimes I miss it. Not the cold or the hunger, but the simplicity, when it was just us against the world. Now we've got contracts and obligations and people depending on us to perform our trauma for entertainment. George sat beside her, the cockpit barely big enough for 2 people and 1 judgmental cat. We're not performing trauma, we're sharing survival. There's a difference. Is there? Yeah. Trauma is what happened to us. Survival is what we did about it. And if people want to pay premium rates to stay in the place where we survived, that's not exploitation. That's capitalism, and for once, it's working in our favor. Evelyn considered this. When did you become a philosopher? I've always been a philosopher, you just never listened. She elbowed him gently. I listen. Sometimes. When you're not talking about duct tape. April brought more changes. Summit Ventures sent a marketing team to photograph the plane, interview them, create promotional materials. The photos were stunning professional shots that made the plane look both rugged and romantic, the kind of place adventure seekers and Instagram influencers would fight over. The interview process was harder. A perky woman named Amanda with a clipboard and too much enthusiasm asked questions clearly designed to create sound bites. What would you say to your daughter if she were here right now? Evelyn's face went cold. Next question. But our research shows that family estrangement is a key part of your story. Next question, or this interview is over. Amanda backed off, but Evelyn could see her making notes. They'd use the daughter angle anyway, spin it into their marketing somehow. Everything was content now, even pain. George found her later, sitting in their bedroom, the former crew quarters, now actually livable with a real bed and everything. You okay? No. She was holding her phone, staring at the blank screen. I keep thinking I should call her, tell her what's happening, show her we're okay. She laughed bitterly. Why do I still care what she thinks? Because she's your daughter, that doesn't just stop, even when it should. Have you thought about calling her? George was quiet for a long moment. Every day. And every day I remember that she had our number. She had every opportunity to check on us, to fix what she broke. She chose not to. That tells me everything I need to know. Evelyn set down her phone. I used to think the worst thing was losing the store, then I thought it was losing our home. But the worst thing is losing her, and not knowing if there was ever anything there to lose. They sat together in their small room, listening to contractors work on the exterior, preparing their home, their plane for strangers who would never understand what it had meant to survive here. The reservations started coming in mid-April. The first booking was from a couple in Chicago anniversary trip looking for something unique. The second was a tech executive from California wanting to disconnect. The third was a writer researching a book on alternative living. We're booked through September, George announced, reading the schedule Summit Ventures had sent over. $350 a night, with breakfast included. $350. Evelyn repeated the number like it was a foreign language. People are paying $350 to sleep in our home. Our heritage experience, George corrected, using the marketing language. I hate everything about this, except the part where we get paid and have housing for life. Except that part, she agreed. May 1st arrived with sunshine that felt like an apology from the universe. The ski resort, now called Millbrook Summit Resort, officially opened with a ceremony that featured champagne, speeches, and a ribbon cutting that George and Evelyn were required to attend. They wore the uniforms Summit Ventures had provided. Khaki pants, navy blue jackets with patches that said Captain George and Captain Evelyn, and matching caps that looked vaguely military. I look like I deliver singing telegrams, Evelyn muttered, adjusting her cap. You look distinguished, Beth said, straightening Evelyn's collar. She'd appointed herself as their unofficial stylist and moral support. I look ridiculous. You look employed, Ray corrected. That's not ridiculous, that's winning. The ceremony was everything George and Evelyn weren't: polished, corporate, carefully scripted. Jonathan Wright gave a speech about heritage and resilience and luxury experiences. The mayor of Millbrook Creek said something about community and growth. A representative from the Minnesota Tourism Board talked about rural revitalization. And then it was George's turn to speak. He approached the microphone with the same confidence he'd used to greet customers at Parker's Fix-It-All for 50 years. Evelyn watched him, her heart doing that thing it had done for 5 decades, swelling with pride and terror in equal measure. 6 months ago, George began, his voice carrying across the crowd of investors, tourists, and locals. My wife and I were homeless. We had $300, a cat with an attitude problem, and no idea how we'd survive the winter. He paused. We found this plane by accident, or maybe it found us. Either way, it saved our lives. Not because it was comfortable or safe or anything most people would call livable, but because it gave us something to fight for. A place to be stubborn. A place to refuse to quit. Evelyn felt tears threatening and blinked them back aggressively. George continued. Now that same plane is part of a luxury resort, and I know some people think that's selling out or betraying our story or whatever. But here's the thing, survival isn't pure. It's messy and complicated, and sometimes it means making deals with people who have what you need. We needed security. They needed our story. So we negotiated. And now we get to stay in the home we built while also making sure other people understand what it took to build it. He looked directly at Evelyn. My wife likes to say we're not performing trauma, we're sharing survival. She's right. We're not here to make anyone feel guilty or sad. We're here to show what's possible when you refuse to be erased, when you fight back against a world that says you're obsolete. That's the real luxury, knowing you still matter. The applause was thunderous. Evelyn walked up to join him, taking his hand as cameras flashed. They stood together in front of the plane that had tried to be their grave and became their salvation, and smiled for the photographs that would appear in newspapers and websites and travel magazines. Later, after the ceremony, after the crowds dispersed, after Summit Ventures executives congratulated themselves on a successful launch, George and Evelyn stood alone by their plane in the late afternoon light. We did it, George said. We survived, Evelyn corrected. There's a difference. Is there? She considered. Yeah. Surviving is just not dying. We did more than that. We lived on our terms. That's not just survival. That's revolution. George kissed her forehead, his beard now neatly trimmed for their new roles, but still unmistakably his. Revolutionary hospitality professionals. That should be our new title. I'm sticking with Captain, Evelyn said. It sounds more intimidating. Their first guests arrived the next morning, the anniversary couple from Chicago. They were younger than George and Evelyn expected, maybe early 40s, carrying expensive luggage and looking simultaneously excited and nervous. Welcome to Captain George's crash pad, Evelyn said, channeling every ounce of hardware store customer service she'd accumulated over 50 years. I'm Captain Evelyn. That's Captain George. The cat in the cockpit is Whiskers. He doesn't take reservations and he will judge you. Any questions? The woman laughed, tension breaking. This is amazing. We've been following your story since the news coverage. You two are inspirational. We're stubborn, George corrected. There's a difference. They showed the couple around, explaining the history, demonstrating George's original stove design, telling edited versions of their survival story that didn't include the darkest parts. Evelyn made breakfast pancakes, eggs, bacon, the works, while George entertained with stories about various repair disasters at the hardware store. The couple ate, laughed, asked questions, took photos. They were genuinely interested, genuinely moved. And when they left 2 days later, they left a review that made Summit Ventures' marketing department weep with joy. More than a hotel room, more than an experience, this is what resilience looks like, and it's beautiful. They called us beautiful, Evelyn said, reading the review on the tablet Ray had taught her to use. They called the plane beautiful, George corrected. Same thing. We're part of the plane now. We've merged. We're a hybrid organism, part human, part aircraft, all stubborn. More guests came. The tech executive who didn't actually disconnect, they caught him on his phone multiple times, but who said the plane made him reflect on what really matters. The writer who spent hours interviewing them and promised their story would be in her book. A retired pilot who cried when he sat in the cockpit and remembered his own service. Each guest was different. Each brought their own reasons for coming. But they all left changed somehow, touched by the story of two people who'd turned abandonment into agency, desperation into determination. And through it all, George and Evelyn adapted. They became hosts, storytellers, living proof that age didn't mean obsolescence. They woke early, prepared meals, shared their lives with strangers who paid premium rates for the privilege. It wasn't the life they'd planned. It wasn't even a life they'd imagined. But it was theirs, earned through stubbornness and survival and refusing to accept the ending someone else had written for them. "Do you ever regret it?" George asked one night, after their latest guests had gone to bed in the plane's sleeping quarters, while they retreated to the small cottage Summit Ventures had built for them nearby, a compromise that gave guests the full plane experience while giving George and Evelyn privacy. Regret what? All of it. The plane, the deal, becoming tourist attractions. Evelyn was quiet, really thinking about it. "No," she finally said. "I regret Gerald stealing from us. I regret Melissa abandoning us. I regret getting old and broken. But the plane? The survival? This weird life we've built? No regrets. This is ours. We built it. Nobody gave it to us. Nobody can take it away. That's worth more than dignity. That's power." George pulled her close, and they sat together in their small cottage, listening to guests settling into their plane, tourists sleeping in the home that had almost been a tomb. Tomorrow would bring new guests, new stories to tell, new performances of their survival. But tonight, they were just George and Evelyn Parker, 76 and 74, still here, still fighting, still refusing to quit, still winning. The first frost of October came early, painting the fields around Millbrook Summit Resort in crystalline white and reminding George and Evelyn that they'd survived a full year since that desperate December when they'd first stumbled onto the plane. They stood outside the aircraft, their aircraft, legally theirs now, according to the contract Summit Ventures had finally finalized, watching their latest guests check out with promises to leave 5-star reviews. "Another successful weekend," George said, waving as the couple's car disappeared down the resort road. "Another weekend of selling our trauma," Evelyn corrected. But there was no real bite in it anymore. She'd made peace with what they were doing mostly. On good days, she even believed George's philosophy about sharing survival instead of performing pain. They'd hosted over 100 guests since May. Each one left changed in small ways, more grateful, more aware, more conscious of how easily life could shift from stable to desperate. Some cried hearing their story. Others asked uncomfortable questions about Melissa that Evelyn had learned to deflect with practiced grace. A few became repeat visitors, drawn back to the strange alchemy of resilience the plane represented. The money was good, better than good. Between their percentage of the nightly rate and the tips generous guests left, they'd saved more in 6 months than they'd managed to keep in the final years of the hardware store. Summit Ventures deposited their share like clockwork, and for the first time since Gerald's embezzlement, George and Evelyn had financial security. But it was the letters that surprised them most. Letters from people who'd heard their story, read articles, seen the news coverage. Letters from adult children apologizing to their own parents for treating them as burdens. Letters from elderly people finding courage to fight against being warehoused against their will. Letters from strangers saying thank you for refusing to disappear quietly. Evelyn kept them all in a box George had made, reading them when the weight of performing got too heavy, reminding herself that their choice to go public had mattered beyond just survival. "Package for you," Ray announced, arriving with his usual delivery of supplies and gossip. "Came to my place by mistake. Postman still can't believe you actually live in a plane." The package was small, return address in Scottsdale, Arizona. Evelyn's hands shook as she held it. It's from her, she said quietly. George's face hardened. You don't have to open it. I know. But she did anyway, because closure required confrontation, even when you didn't want it. Inside was a letter, handwritten on expensive stationery, and a check. Evelyn read the letter twice before speaking. She says she's sorry, that she saw the news coverage, that she didn't realize how badly she'd... Evelyn's voice cracked. She says Brad left her, took all the money she stole from us, and disappeared. She's broke now, living with a roommate, working retail. She looked up at George, tears streaming. She wants to know if we can forgive her. George took the letter, read it himself, his jaw working. And the check? $5,000. She says it's all she has, says she'll send more when she can, says she wants to make it right. They sat in silence, the letter between them like an unexploded bomb. Whiskers, sensing the tension, jumped down from his throne and rubbed against Evelyn's legs. What do you want to do? George finally asked. Evelyn stared at the check, at the letter, at the desperate handwriting of a daughter who'd finally learned what loss felt like. She thought about forgiveness, about justice, about what she owed the girl she'd raised versus what she owed herself. I want to cash the check, she said slowly, and I want to send her a letter back, not forgiving her, not yet, but acknowledging that she tried, that she's learning what we already knew, that life breaks you and you either rebuild or you don't. She looked at George. Is that cruel? It's honest, he replied. Forgiveness isn't automatic. She has to earn it. And Evie, maybe she never does. Maybe the best we can do is acknowledge she's trying without pretending what she did was fixable with one letter and $5,000. So Evelyn wrote back. A short letter explaining that they were surviving, thriving even, without her help. That they'd built a life from nothing after she'd taken everything. That if she wanted to rebuild trust, it would take years, not checks. That they were open to conversation but not reconciliation, at least not yet. She signed it, Your mother, Evelyn Parker, Captain of Flight 0. They mailed it the next morning, and Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness that was still too expensive, but maybe the possibility of it, someday, if Melissa proved she understood the damage she'd caused. The season wound down as November approached. They'd take a break for winter, reopen in spring. Summit Ventures had already booked them solid through next summer. The plane that had almost killed them was now funding their retirement, and the irony wasn't lost on either of them. On their last guest weekend before closing for the season, a family arrived, grandparents, their adult son, and his teenage daughter. The son was quiet, almost ashamed. Over breakfast, he finally spoke. My daughter wanted to come here because she saw your story, and I needed to see it because... He paused, looking at his parents. Because I've been trying to convince my folks to sell their house and move into a facility. After seeing what you survived, what you built, I realized I was doing exactly what your daughter did. Making decisions for them because it was easier for me, not better for them. His parents, both in their 70s, looked at him with cautious hope. So we're here to apologize, the son continued, voice breaking, and to ask what you would do if you were us. George and Evelyn exchanged a look. This was why they did it. Not for money or fame or revenge against Melissa, but for moments like this where their survival became someone else's salvation. Listen to them, Evelyn said simply. Really listen. Not to what's convenient, but to what they want. And if they want to stay in their home until it kills them, let them. Because dying in a place you love is better than dying slowly in a place you hate, surrounded by people who think they know better. The family left in tears, but good tears, healing tears. That night, George and Evelyn sat by the plane, their home, their monument to stubborn survival, and watched the first snow of the new season begin to fall. We did it, George said. We're still doing it, Evelyn corrected. This isn't an ending. It's just a really weird middle. I love our weird middle. Me too. A year ago, they'd been homeless, broken, abandoned. Now they were captains of their own crashed plane turned heritage site, making more money than they had in years, saving other families from their own mistakes, and still refusing to die quietly like the world expected. Somewhere in Scottsdale, Melissa was learning hard lessons. Somewhere in Minnesota fields, their planes stood defiant against winter. And somewhere in between survival and success, George and Evelyn Parker had found something more valuable than either. They'd found proof that refusing to quit wasn't just survival, it was revolution. And as snow fell on aluminum wings that had carried them through the worst year of their lives into the best revenge possible, they held hands and smiled. Still here, still fighting, still winning, always.